I've actually started to diversify my firewood business just a little bit by starting to sell some planters. So here are some of the planters that I cut up, and these are naturally hollow logs. They have a nice natural look to them, and people love to use them to plant flowers and plants and ferns and other things into. Here's a nice picture of one of the planters that I sold that has been staged, and it just looks beautiful. So when I was selling some planters to a particular customer, I was asked if I knew of anybody who sold or made farm tables, and I really don't, but customer asked me if I'd be interested in doing something like that. So long story short, I agreed to do it and set out on a very interesting journey of learning to build a quality farm table. The first thing I needed to do was to find the required stock to build this farm table. The customer had pretty specific criteria. They wanted it to be hardwood. They wanted it to be 8 or 9 or even 10 feet long. And they wanted it to be very rustic, very heavy, rugged, and an outdoor table. And that limits the type of stock you can use. You can't find this stuff at Home Depot. But thankfully, I had access to some materials from a neighbor who lives about a mile and a half from me, and this is the mill that I saw. And it took a long time to pick out the pieces that I needed. First, what I needed to do was put together the design of the table and the various components that I would need, and then rummage through all of these pieces of lumber, and it did take a long time to find just the right pieces. So I took them to my home in 2 truckloads at 2 different times. I'm limited as to when I could do this project because I have a full-time job. But here you can see the raw lumber that I picked out and was going to use to build this farm table. First thing I needed to do was find someone who could rip down the raw material with the live edges to more of a plank type of a product. So I did find someone who had just the right tool, and you can see it being worked here. I actually learned how to use it a little bit, and you just need to set the saw to the correct height so that you're taking off just the right amount of material. And it's quite a fantastic machine, actually. And it went right through it. So I enjoyed that. And basically I used this machine only to rip down the planks for the top of the table. The rest of the planks I could do myself with a circular saw. The next thing was to plane down the boards, particularly for the top of the table. And this is where I learned a lesson that you don't want to use a planer that is substandard like that yellow one that we see here. After spending a few hours trying to plane these things down, we decided that I needed to take them somewhere else. So I took them to a lumber mill that specifically does this type of work. And I did use this rotary saw to sand down some of the planks that I did have planed, and that worked out pretty well. This is a miter saw that I was allowed to use or was loaned to me from a friend to use. It was very helpful in cutting a lot of the planks to the appropriate lengths, in particular in cutting 45-degree angles. These are the first components of the table that I cut. They are what are called the cross arms that will hold the top planks of the table. I wasn't sure how many I would need. I figured 3, 4, maybe 5. I settled on 4, and that was just the right number for this table. And it was neat to see those come together, and then I had to sand where the planer had not um, you know, brought it down to the oak finish, if you will. So of course, doing all this sanding and cutting makes a big mess. So I found myself constantly having to clean up the garage that I made into my makeshift workshop, and it's a lot easier to work when you're not trying to dodge all this sawdust and so forth. What we see here are the two pedestals that I cut. I actually used my circular saw to cut these, and they were from a 6x6 solid piece of oak. So they were really the largest, or at least thickest, piece of material that I had to use. Really, really nice when they were cut and then sanded down. They looked beautiful, and they were very, very sturdy and rugged. One of the things I found when doing this table was just a lot of manual labor, lugging things around. This particular board, which has the live edges still on it, was probably around 100 pounds, give or take, but I enjoy doing that kind of thing. What I'm doing here is I'm measuring up to rip this down myself with a circular saw. And so I'm setting up my plumb line here. I put in a nail on the end to hold one end of the plumb line, and then I pulled it across and would make it secure on the other end, nice and taut. Of course, I pre-measured it beforehand, and then you just snap it, and you have a nice straight line for your cut. Then used a circular saw to rip these edges, and I just did this multiple times with multiple pieces, and I had all of my bracing and my brackets and cross arms and stretchers and feet and all of that for the table. Assemble most of the pieces with a couple of 3-inch outdoor screws, and then also at least one lag bolt, sometimes more. Okay, next I was attaching the cross arms to the upper stretcher, and here I'm making sure that it's centered properly. Just a simple calculation, obviously. In addition to being centered properly, you need to make sure that it's level. So now the table is right side up. You can see some of the truss brackets have already been installed. And in order to make it level, sometimes you need to put a little shim under one side of the component. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. It was all oak. It's 100% oak. No pine or anything like that in this table. So I made sure that I got it perfectly level. And then the other thing is you need to make sure that it's square. So a nice 90-degree angle between the stretcher and the cross arm. Once that's all done, you can start to fasten it together. Again, I use the screws, which I would pre-drill before I inserted the screws, 3-inch screws, and you can see the heat that was generated. Again, this is all oak. It's not like working with pine or spruce. This is hard stuff. Each piece was fastened again with screws and at least one lag bolt, sometimes more than one. So here I'm inserting a screw, which honestly was to more hold it in place before I put in the lag bolts. Here I'm pre-drilling for the lag bolts, and I'm using a larger drill bit for that. I found it was important to do this for a number of reasons. First of all, the lag bolt would just break if you didn't pre-drill, and secondly, it would probably split the wood in some way. I would then bore where needed. I would bore a hole in over the other pre-drilled hole in order to countersink the lag bolt. Again, this is for the cross arm, so the planks of the table are going to go right on top of this flush. So I needed to be able to countersink the lag bolts in this case, and it didn't have to be perfectly countersunk, but I don't know, 1/4 of an inch, somewhere in that range, maybe a little bit more than that. And then I used started to use my drill to put these lag bolts in, but I honestly found that I was breaking the lag bolts. And I got a really nice day, thankfully, to apply the finish. This is finishing off the base, and it was simply a moisture resistant clear finish. It was not a stain, and but I know it works because when I tried to apply a second coat, it would not take that second coat. It would just bead right up. The actual product itself is shown here, and it was a Olympic water guard, and it's mildew resistant. Obviously repels the water. You know, it soaks right in, and it retains the nice natural color of the oak. So now we started to have some fun. These top planks are not yet supported, but I had one of my close friends and neighbors come over, and we just sat down at the table for the very first time and just had a little bit of fun. That you need to have spacing in between these planks, about 1/8 of an inch up to 1/4 of an inch. That is to allow for the wood to expand, and also to allow for the wood to drain any water that gets onto it. And so you don't want cracking, you don't want rotting either. So you have to have some gaps in there. And I put them in and connected them all with these wood clamps. Once that was done, I needed to work on cutting off the ends, and that was another fun part. You just square it off, and as you can see, this table ended up being a little bit over 4 feet in width. It was actually, I think, about 51 inches in width. That's what it looked like after the cut, and then I needed to sand it down a little bit. So just to take off the edges, I didn't want to put a real pronounced bevel on this particular table. I wanted to keep it square. I think that's what the customer wanted as well. Again, each of those pieces are connected to each other, and I started from the bottom up, which was necessary because of the design that I chose to do. They all have lag bolts as well as screws, and when I would connect the lag or insert the lag bolts, again, I would pre-drill using a larger drill bit, doing it just with
I was using
a rugged socket set. So
drill to put these in.
that's how I finished off all of my lag bolts. But the final steps was when you get to the top, I wanted to make sure that again the top planks were quite flush, and so I would just simply take a planer, handheld planer, and went over the pieces where I needed to, and then I would sand them if that needed to be done, and then I would apply the top coat of the water repellent sealer. And by then the table was done, and this is what it looked like. What you really don't get here is the weight of this table. It probably weighed, I'm going to say 500 to 600 pounds. It was extremely heavy. It took six of my neighbors to get it into my truck and to deliver it to the customer. And then we had 4 people on the other end, and we had to take, we were huffing and puffing, and we had to take breaks to get it to the person's backyard. But this is where it ended up, and it's got a nice new home, wonderful people. And I really enjoyed building this farm table, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video.